Thank you and welcome everybody. My name is Dave Reeser. I am serving as the chair for the STIF Advisory Committee meeting, and today is Tuesday, November 19th, and we'll go ahead here in a moment and do roll call. And I think we might have at least one person I know of might be arriving a little late. So let's go ahead and get started. Phil Barnhart. No, Kelly Clark, I believe, is absent. Josh Kaczynski.
Present.
Brenda Kosidar is absent. Susie Lacer.
Here.
Did I hear here? Yeah, okay,
Yep,
great.
I'm
So
here.
thank you. Joshua Myatt.
Good evening, present on Zoom.
Great, thank you. Eugene Oregon. His absence. Cosette Reese.
Present.
Thank you. I'm here. Carrie Turner.
Present.
Thank you. And Vidal Francis, I believe, is going to arrive a little late. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, he said he'd be a few minutes late.
Okay. And Gino Grimaldi is not here. And Pete Knox.
Here.
Great. Thank you, Pete. All right. So we just completed roll call. I believe we have a quorum. And agenda review. You should all have an agenda either printed in front of you or online. We have it on the screen, it looks like, as well. In a moment, we'll do public comment, and then we'll welcome LTD staff up to talk about federal sections 5310, 5311 funding. Then we'll move down to STIF formula funds. And then we'll talk about the factors and criteria to consider, discussion of STIF formula fund proposals. And then near the end, we'll talk about next and future meeting agendas, and then we'll adjourn. We'll be aiming for a 6:30 conclusion. Anybody have any questions or comments on the agenda? All right. Well, let's go ahead and open the public comment period. Do we have anybody here from the public to speak? Nope. All right, so I will close the public comments. Moving right along, we'll move to agenda item 5 and we'll welcome John. Hi, John. I almost said good morning, so good evening.
Morning, good evening, and good night. Thanks for having me. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about federal section 5310 and 5311 funds. Let's start with a little bit of history. So probably for members of a STIF committee are wondering, why are we talking about section 5310 and 5311 funds? We've already gone over I think the project descriptions of the different types of tasks that LTD intends to incorporate into our STIF plan. These are all projects that have historically been a part of LTD's STF process in the past. And these, both STF funds and now, as they're known, STIF population-based formula funds, by themselves are not sufficient to be able to fully fund these programs. So both in the past, LTD has convened what was known as a STF advisory group, or STF discretionary grant group. And so as STF funds have later evolved into what we now know as STIF population-based formula funds, so too has LTD's project management plan for the use and allocation of 5310 funds, as well as 5311 funds, which are formula funds received through ODOT that have historically matched against STF and now STIF population-based formula funds to continue these ongoing programs that primarily benefit older adults, people with disabilities, and rural communities as a whole. So with that, I'm going to be getting more into how the dollars work rather than the programs themselves. So let me just give you a little bit more information about what 5310 and 5311 funds are. Similar to STIF formula funds, these are all formula allocations that come to our community. These in particular are based on ridership and revenue miles. So 5311 funds very specifically are intended for rural communities of less than 50,000 people. You might say, well, this isn't a community of less than 50,000 people. It's actually very specific to services that are provided in Cottage Grove area and Florence area. So those are two separate 5311 programs that are coordinated through LTD. New to us in the current biennium is the transferring of City of Cottage Grove's 5311 program to LTD. And this is through their request, and we look to continue that into the upcoming biennium through our own 5311 application. So whether the funds flow through LTD or not, the intention is that they go to support these communities. So we continue to keep those funds in both Florence and Cottage Grove area. The main difference is that we're consolidating the administrative work that goes into keeping these grants up. As LTD has in-house technical expertise and being able to do that, it's more of a natural fit, where I think this was more of a burden to, say, City of Cottage Grove staff. So I think we're willing to take that on to be able to continue transportation services in the area. Section 5310 funds are intended to benefit specifically older adults and people with disabilities. And so you'll see that our population-based formula funds are all typically and historically programs that either directly benefit older adults and people with disabilities or Cottage Grove and Florence in our rural areas, which in turn, as services that are open to the general public, are accessible, have lifts, ramps, or otherwise benefiting the disability communities in rural areas as well. With that, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. It shows, oh, sorry. Thanks, appreciate that. It shows our population-based formula funds. These come with a, these are historically used as funds that match the federal funds, which come with a requirement that we put in local or state dollars to be able to support these services. So part of the rationale for creating this kind of complex, stiff formula plan is because, thanks. In order to be able to best make use and stretch our federal dollars, they must be supported with either local or state funds. And STIF formula funds are uniquely positioned and most flexible to be able to do that. Section 5310 funds come with a 10.27% match rate, and 5311 funds come with a 43.92% match rate, at least for the purposes as we've proposed in our coordinated plan. The guiding documents that inform these allocations are ones that you've, I believe, heard of, which are our lane coordinated transportation plan. And just as a brief reminder, there are 3 priorities within that. First, we want to be able to keep doing what we've been doing. Second, we want to be able to expand existing programs where funding allows. And then finally, to consider new programs when possible, if there are funds left over. We also have our LTD's project management plan for the use of 5310 funds, and those essentially defer to this body and formally the STF committee to be able to review these allocations as part of a process to keep this in public view. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Sorry, I've got a click or two. This gets into how the actual dollars work. So there are several programs listed on here. And again, I'm not going to rehash what the programs do, but instead concentrate on how the funding works. We have first our RideSource paratransit services. This is a well-funded program using stiff population-based
John,
formula
can
fund.
I just interrupt for a sec? If people are having trouble seeing this, you might want to look at
Oh.
page 8 in your packet.
That's a great call. Thank you.
Thanks.
And just to give you an example, our RideSource ADA paratransit service, we estimate that this is going to require a budget of over $7 million in grant, general funds, and fare box revenue over the course of the upcoming biennium. And you'll notice only a very small proportion of that is allocated as 5310 funds. So we're definitely overmatching the 10.27% amount required through federal funds. This also preserves it as an option, however, that if any of our other federally 5310 funds do not use their full allocation, it allows us, if we need to, be able to transfer in additional funds that can relieve the general fund burden on the program itself. So as a reminder, paratransit is a required service and we don't have control over utilization rates. So every time someone calls us for a trip, we are required to provide it. It's expensive service. And so this is an opportunity for us to make sure that we are completely using all of our formula grant funds before the end of the biennium, before we need to tap into payroll tax dollars. Preventative maintenance is for a fleet of currently 67 vehicles and climbing. This is a substantive use of 5310 funds. We have an aging vehicle fleet. So this apportions approximately $7,000 per vehicle, which is in line with our estimated costs. Those go up and down based on which vehicles and programs are in use. So we may have an older vehicle that has an engine blow up that needs to be completely replaced or overhauled, and it's going to be much more expensive than that. We may have a newer vehicle that requires very little preventative maintenance. And so that winds up being an important investment in us being able to keep services rolling throughout our community. So to support the operations of services, we need vehicles to be able to do that, and to keep vehicles running, we need preventive maintenance to be able to make that happen. This is entirely vehicles that are fully accessible and support the operations of services that benefit older adults and people with disabilities, primarily RideSource. Also includes vehicles that operate in Florence for the Rodeo Express, in Oak Ridge for the Diamond Express, and in South Lane County. We also use 5310 funds to support volunteer mileage reimbursement through a program that we coordinate with senior and disability services. And so this is providing transportation or benefiting particularly people with disabilities, working with a case manager at Senior and Disability Services who is unable to connect with other transportation options. Our behavioral health transportation also primarily is using 5310 funds to support it, matched with STIF formula dollars. Our Crucial Connections program, same 5310 funds matched with STIF formula dollars. And then as you go further down, we'll get to our first 5311 recipient. These are South Lane operations. And what we're proposing is to essentially increase the amount of mobility on demand services that are in the area. And so we'll consolidate services to increase the frequency of the Cottage Grove connector using 5311 dollars overmatched with STIF formula funds. And then separately, you've previously heard that we've initiated a STIF discretionary application to support rural services with an origin and destination on-demand pilot. So that's overmatched with STIF formula funds, which also includes estimated fare box revenue for that service. We also include our travel training and transit host programs, currently contracted through Alternative Work Concepts, and transportation eligibility assessments, which is a collaborative agreement with Senior and Disability Services, Whitebird Clinic, and Alternative Work Concepts alongside LTD and our RideSource service to be able to establish eligibility for paratransit and related services in our area. And then finally, our Florence Rodeo Express, which is supported by 5311 funds, again, matched with STIF formula dollars to be able to provide fixed route transportation and associated paratransit in the area. So it gives an idea of the complex interrelated nature of how these funds work to support these types of programs. We're not proposing anything new other than what I've pointed out already. In particular, the biggest change is just the shift of 5311 funds from the city of Cottage Grove to LTD in the current biennium, which we propose to continue into the upcoming biennium, but to otherwise continue to fund existing services as identified. These are all programs that have been in the coordinated plan, which is quite stale at this point. So I'll note that the last version of the coordinated plan is from 2019, even though it's come before both versions of this group and the board more recently than that. We're proposing a major rework or rewrite of that starting in January of 2025. So we would certainly look to this group to be able to help support those efforts as well, to be able to continue to identify how we're choosing to prioritize and allocate these funds into the future and make sure that there are transportation services that benefit older adults and people with disabilities. So this is just kind of a very brief high-level overview of how these different funds kind of work with one another, noting that none of these programs could exist with any one funding source in a vacuum. So it requires distribution and allocation of these funds across programs in what are typically referred to as our population-based formula programs. But I want to make sure that we had opportunity for any questions, comments, or feedback on how these funds are being distributed or the programs themselves.
All right, thank you. Open it up to the committee for any questions or comments. Anybody online? Josh rose his hand.
I feel like I've asked this question before, but I'm still having trouble keeping it straight. The relationship between 5310, 5311, and the population-based formula funds are what again?
So they are all based on a formula that comes to our area or our community and in slightly different ways. So simple way of thinking about it is all of these are passing through ODOT before they come to LTD. And then LTD essentially is holding these funds with the intention that we're allocating them for the purposes in which they're designated, which are slightly different, but all complementary to one another. So you're well versed with the way that STIF formula funds and specifically are being allocated. 5310 funds very specifically should benefit programs that serve older adults and people with disabilities, which dovetails nicely with some of these STIF formula projects. And then 5311 funds should very specifically benefit communities with under 50,000 people in rural areas. And very specifically, that includes Cottage Grove and Florence. With the current applications, it can include other areas as well. So these all work together in that they have matching requirements in which both the purposes of the programs that they fund and then the grants themselves are very complementary to be able to ensure that these operations can continue. So both the 5310 and 5311 funds are a good supplement to STIF formula funds, but in turn rely on STIF formula funds for the matching requirement to be able to offer these services throughout our community. Does that get to the question you were asking?
I think so. So is there a separate, not bucket isn't the right word, but we've got the STIF formula funds in general.
Yes.
But I felt like as part of the SDF consolidation, there was a separate sort of pot that had to be spent in a particular way. Is that correct? Or?
Yes, separate from what I'm describing today. So in particular, the 5310 and 5311 funds come as a separate allocation to our community. So there isn't necessarily a requirement that they be spent in the same way that, say, like a STIF formula fund would, or say a STIF discretionary allocation would. However, both historically and in our proposal, they are a natural fit for what we call the STIF population-based formula funds. So they're allocated to us based on the number of the ridership of the programs that we offer and the revenue miles of the programs that have been in place in the prior biennium, as well as just based on the population of our area. So we receive an allocation based on a statewide formula. So every version of LTD throughout the state is receiving their own portion of 5310 funds or 5311 funds separate from their STIF formula allocations. And those are calculated separately from the way that STIF formula funds are calculated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great question. Other questions or comments? I have a question, and I may have didn't hear something or missed it, but I think I heard you say a couple of these were overmatched.
Yes.
I believe, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the strategy behind that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And then also, I think just to maybe more completely answer the last question I had, the 5310 and 5311 funds are federal funds, even though we're receiving them via ODOT. So those are a component historically of the FAST Act at the federal level. So they're just coming in through that channel. But overmatch just refers to there's a minimum requirement for the amount of funds that need to put on the table to match the federal funds. That can include local funds, meaning cash that we have on hand or general funds. It can include state funds, but we're not allowed to match federal to federal dollars. So for example, I couldn't use 5310 funds to match a 5311 grant. It's just not an allowable use of the grant. By overmatching, it's both a testament to the amount of payroll tax dollars that we're currently receiving through the STIF formula program, as well as I think what we're noting is the total cost of being able to provide these programs is typically going to be greater than the need of any one grant in itself. So if we didn't have STIF formula funds, and we've seen some of this in the past, it can lead to needing to either require general funds or needing to be able to make service cuts or being able to scale back programs accordingly. So through the use of STIF funds, we're able to make sure that these programs are able to operate at the levels necessary to be able to provide service. What we've noticed is that the amount of federal 5310 or 5311 funds has either not been increasing or has slightly decreased than in other years, while inflation and the cost of being able to provide services continues to go up. So the only way to be able to continue service levels is to be able to fill with, say, like STIF formula funds. So while the match requirement remains the same, us continuing to put additional dollars on the table means that we're going above and beyond the minimum amount that would be necessary for us to meet the use of federal funds, which is certainly not a problem at the federal level. So they're saying this is the minimum amount necessary to even receive the funds and to be able to utilize them. There's definitely no restrictions on us being able to put more than our minimum share to be able to fund a program. The programs themselves, though, would definitely not be able to operate solely on 5310 or 5311 dollars at the minimum match rate.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I can't see anybody online, but are we monitoring that? Okay, great. One more question I had. I think I heard you say one of these project names was related to Cottage Grove, and that normally money would go to them, but it's going to LTD. Is that correct? And then I'm assuming they're supportive of this, right? And is that just because LTD can administer that more easily than they could?
Correct. This is actually at the City of Cottage Grove's request that we've taken on these services. So we have a South Lane operations line that kind of gives our budget. But let me note that even prior to that, we work very closely with City of Cottage Grove on these programs. So in the past, even though City of Cottage Grove had been a direct 5311 recipient through ODOT, LTD has historically provided that match and overmatch to be able to support programs in the area. So it's always been a very close working relationship. And I think it would be fair to characterize that LTD was more strategically positioned to have the technical expertise to provide administrative support for grants that we already do.
Right.
So for example, we do that on behalf of the city of Florence as well. And I think we're just a more natural fit to
Right.
be able to provide some of that administrative assistance where, say, particularly for cities in rural areas, they may not necessarily have a transit grant position in the same way that we're able to provide.
Great. Okay. That's a great example of regional collaboration. So
Exactly.
thank you.
Thank you.
Any other last questions for John before we move on? All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joel. I
Appreciate it.
appreciate it.
And next on the agenda, we're moving down to Kathleen's going to talk to us about STIF formula funds, factors, and criteria to consider.
Yes, I wanted to take a little time tonight to talk about the various criteria and factors that all of you should be taking into consideration when you look at the projects and tasks in the STIF plan that we've been presenting to you. I put these in your packet as well, but there are criteria that come from ODOT. There are some overarching goals that come from the Oregon Public Transportation Plan. And there's some other factors I'm going to touch on about how the funds are distributed or are allocated throughout the county and to different areas. I've said before, the committee's role is to review formula fund projects and provide a recommendation to the LTD board. And I know in my email, I kept referring to projects as well. And before I start, I wanted to provide a little clarity around that. If I could have the next, thanks. So for those of you who have been on the committee in the past, you know that in past STIF plans, LTD has had a number of projects. I think we have like 7 or 8 in our current STIF plan. This year, we made the decision to just go with one project for all of the LTD tasks and one project for the LCOG tasks. The reason we did that is a very practical reason. ODOT has certain rules about how you can move STIF funds around during the biennium. If you have a project with tasks in it, you can easily move funds from one task to another within that same project. You cannot easily move funds from one project to another project. So by opting this year to have just one overarching project, we're preserving that funding flexibility for ourselves. It allows us to have the option going forward to move funds much more just much more easily. It will, if we have projects that we are underutilizing, we can take some of those funds and move it to a project that's being overutilized. And it just gives us the flexibility to do that without having to jump through as many hoops or not being able to even do it at all under current rules. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So, like I said, I've put these criteria in your packet, so I just was going to touch on them quickly. You'll notice that the first 3 criteria have to do with increasing service or expanding routes or reducing fares for areas with what they call a high percentage of low-income households. So I just want to note that. Go right ahead, Carrie.
So given what you just explained about the difference between projects and tasks, we're still looking to evaluate them on the task level. Right?
Exactly.
And so
yeah.
the criteria is really about whether the task would do.
Yeah,
things.
wherever you see project, just insert
okay.
task.
Cool. Thank you.
That would be a good way to do it.
Okay,
yeah.
thanks.
So I'm going to come back in a few minutes and talk more about the high percentage of low-income households. So we'll come back and touch on that in more detail. Some of the other criteria have to do with environmental sustainability. They're also looking if we're providing services for high school students, for older adults and people with disabilities. And there are criteria that relate to improving, for example, the frequency of service connections between communities inside and outside of the LTD's service area. Next slide, please. Thanks. In addition, things to consider are whether the project or task maintains an existing service. the extent to which the task or the project, overall project goals meet public transportation needs and are a responsible use of public funds, whether the project benefits or burdens historically or currently marginalized communities, and any other factors that we or that you as a committee determine are relevant. One example is geographic equity. And then I mentioned there's some overarching goals that we get from the Oregon Public Transportation Plan, and those tie in nicely with the criteria that I just mentioned: mobility, accessibility, equity, health, environmental sustainability again, collaboration across entities, funding and strategic investment. Thanks, Brianna. So I was going to talk a little bit about how we divvy up these funds within Lane County. I've showed you this slide before just to show you the total STIF funds available, but this time I wanted to point out the difference between the funds that are allocated by ODOT within the LTD district and those outside of the LTD district. I did the math and I didn't write it down, but I think they're allocating about 8.5% for outside the LTD district. And I wanted to note that traditionally LTD has allocated significantly more than that for areas outside of our district. It might help if we go to the next slide. If you see where the LTD's district is, this pink area in the middle of the county is the district that LTD serves. You can see we go up out the McKenzie, down to Cottage Grove, out to Lowell, out to Veneta. And then we have services in rural areas that we also fund in Florence and Cottage Grove, as John was talking about, in Oak Ridge. So how do we decide how to allocate these funds? Because you're aware that most of the STIF dollars come from a payroll tax. That payroll tax is collected from employers, and most of the employers are in the metropolitan area or within LTD's district. The way we did that this year is Kate and I met in August with other public transportation service providers and potential subrecipients, namely all of the incorporated municipalities in Lane County, and we presented different options for how to divvy up those funds. We presented options such as allocating funds by county commission or district, by dividing the county up and down, east and west of I-5, and also by dividing it within the LTD district and outside of the LTD district, the way that ODOT does when they do their allocation. And based on that meeting, we decided to go ahead and allocate according to the ODOT formula. Folks thought that that gave us the most flexibility for how we want to establish services in the outside of the district areas of the county. Kate, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, I want to say, I think just the important thing is that when the providers meet and talk about it, part of the rule is that this is kind of a starting off place to present to you all to say, this is what the providers wanted as for your conversation for how this should be allocated. So I think that starting off place is an important phrase that's in the rules to make sure that we know that this is then for you all to talk about kind of how the funds get allocated across the county.
Thanks, Kate. And then if I could have the next slide, thanks. I said I was going to come back to the low-income households. So in the advisory committee bylaws, a high percentage of low-income households is defined as an area where the percentage of low-income households is above the state of Oregon average number of low-income households statewide in the same year. That number currently, the statewide average is 28%. And I wanted to point out too that these types of improvements and service expansions and things like that, that the criteria we're looking for don't have to actually occur in those areas with high numbers of low-income households. They can be services that benefit those areas by connecting, for example, by connecting those areas to metropolitan areas or things along those lines. And we have a map we were going to show you. Thanks, Brianna. So this is the overall map. If you look at the lighter green, pink, and you cannot see them very well, but the reddish areas, those are the areas with the highest percentage of low-income households. And I'm going to have Brianna click on the top 20% so you can see the highest needs area. Oh. There we go. And you can see that there are areas, especially in Western Lane County, Southeastern Lane County, and then quite a few areas within the metropolitan area that have over 50% of their households low income. I just wanted to give you all a sense of that. And then with those criteria in mind, I'd like to be able to just open it up for discussion about the various tasks in the two STIF projects that you've looked at. I was just going to give a quick update to start with on our funding situation, because you know that last time we were about 4.6 million over. We've made some adjustments to our budget, and we've shaved about almost $1 million off of that deficit, but we're still about 3.6 million over at this point. At the end of the meeting, I'll tell you a couple of updates that have happened since we put together this packet that will shave off another $1 million. And then our goal is by the time we meet next to have a balanced budget to show to all of you. Next slide, thanks. The changes that we've made so far, we had a mobility on demand pilot. This was sort of a to be determined project. You'll see that we reduced this budget to $1 per year, which probably sounds a little preposterous. How do you do a transportation service on $1 a year? This is part of when I was talking about being able to transfer funds between tasks within a project. This is one of those, an example of how you could do that. By putting this project in at $1 per year, it sort of serves as a placeholder for LTD. We have the project in there. If it turns out we have STIF funds that we're not using in another project, we'll be able to easily transfer them into this project. But for now, we can reduce the cost of that project, and or that's reduces the budget by about 700,000.
Kathleen,
Yes.
if I may ask a quick question on that. So I'm curious, I mean, first of all, that makes sense what you described. It's the placeholder of $1. Can you describe if, let's say a year from now, LTD decides to move funds, when you mentioned it could happen easily, is that solely at like the board's discretion or staff's discretion, or is there more committee or public input? What does that look like?
That's a great question. It still needs to go through ODOT approval.
Okay.
We would have to go to ODOT, propose what we plan to do and why, and show them how we're using the funds and planned or not using funds and how we plan to use them in the future. And they would have to approve that.
Okay, so ODOT staff.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Cosette.
Thanks, Kate, or thanks, Kathleen and Kate. So in addition to being able to transfer funds from one task to another, would this also then enable us by having a placeholder if there's more than what ODOT estimated that we would have in the next biennium, that we would be able to allocate some new or additional funding toward these projects?
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you, Cosette. We would be able to do that. Yeah. Josh.
I actually have a follow-up to that. You had talked before about the difference between the expected funds and how it's currently 3.5 million, and you're trying to shave that down more. Wouldn't it then be a good idea to leave some amount of, you know, gap there so that if there were more funds available, they could be spent?
We do have a built-in gap. ODOT asks us in our STIF budget to budget for 20% over what their expected allocation is. So that builds in that gap in case more funds become available than are anticipated. We've got that contingency, we call it, built in.
So is that included in the current, I don't know what to call the number, deficit, I guess?
It is included.
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
I think it's helpful to see that probably on page 15 of the packet. You can see that extra 20%. And I just want to clarify one thing around the ask. Right now, and if we were to use this budget right now, it's a MIT, and right now we would request 40.7 million. If that's how much ODOT would be allocated, they would be allowed to give us. So if we generated 45 million, they would only be allowed to give us that 40 million this biennium. And then it would sit in a pot until the next biennium. And then they would give us a check right at the beginning. So just, it is a little weird. We do want to have over budget. That's why that 20% is extra important to make sure that, because they're only allowed to give us what's in the plan.
Thank you.
Yes, so the two other changes we've made, you probably remember Dave Roth talked last time about the trip planning mobile app and mentioned that LTD had recently gotten a federal attain grant. So we no longer need that task. So we've deleted that from the plan, and that reduced 300,000 from the overall 2-year budget. And Kate, do you want to talk about the Link Lane change?
Sure. Normally Kelly would do this, but she is in South America right now. But yes, so for Link Lane, actually, since Link Lane submitted their application, we actually had the school districts reach out and ask if there could be a student fare program similar to what LTD does for the Link Lane service. So we're trying to work with the Safe Routes to School coordinator right now to find out what their estimated budget needs are. So we've already gone ahead and increased it. That might change a little bit based on, we haven't heard back from the Safe Routes to School coordinator yet about what they think that cost would be and how many fares we would need to provide.
So now you're armed with tons of information, more than you probably wanted. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave. And I think it'd be a great time to open up the floor to just have a discussion about the various tasks, any concerns you have about them, any that you think should be prioritized, any that you have any questions about. Dave and John are both here from LTD to answer questions if you have them. And
Great. Yes, Carrie.
I have one clarifying question. I just making sure I didn't hear Kate wrong. So looking at page 15, and Kathleen, you had said that the goal would be to get to the next meeting to balance the budget. So if the anticipated STIF funds are 37 million, but they'll only give up to whatever amount is budgeted, what's the incentive for decreasing the 40 million to match what the anticipated funds are?
I think this is my opinion, but I think right now it's helpful for you all to weigh in to, if I guess we could technically come up with a budget that's like $100 million, right? We could just, but I think part of it is to make sure that there is transparency with you all to say these are the highest priorities to make it somewhat in line. So that 20% buffer helps to make sure that there's not funds that we can't access,
Okay.
but it also makes it to be pretty in line with what we expect to have so that it helps to then guide staff over the next 2 years to make sure that they're implementing the plans and the programs that the STIF Advisory Committee has recommended to the board.
Okay, so it's just a goal at being realistic.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
And then, yes, because there's not currently a process in place really to come back later and say, okay, now how do we pare down because there's less money,
Yes.
So,
Okay, thank you.
Great question. I think related to that, my question is, so looking at page 15, it's about what, 3.5, 3.6 million that, did I hear you correctly saying between this meeting and the next meeting that staff will be trying to get that down, right, to a balanced amount?
that's our goal. Yeah.
Okay, so then for today, would it be most helpful to staff is the goal that we as a committee talk through like areas we talked about potential prioritization, but should we also be talking about like, well, if you're going to scale something down, maybe do task, 2, not task 8, like that kind of detail? Or is that, I don't know, how might that be helpful?
Dave, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I just want to be efficient.
Right.
Oh, sorry. I guess, or do we go till 6 o'clock?
6:30.
Oh, 6:30. So we do have some time. I mean, it could be worthwhile just going through and taking feedback along the way, from the group.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be sort of efficient about it, and
Right.
I think we can collect the feedback that we received tonight, and then it's our job to go back and
Right.
I think do the hard work of
Okay.
actually making those
Right.
changes.
Okay. And then Kathleen, in your email to us ahead of time, your email was very helpful. This is the one on Tuesday, November 12th. You gave us some guidance here, and you also talked about projects in the past have been prioritized in 3 categories: maintaining existing service, expand existing service, and develop new service, right? So in this discussion tonight, is the committee interested in, as we go through these, kind of labeling those into those buckets, or it feels like those are kind of predetermined based on the project, are they not? I mean, if it's existing or new, right? But is it just us determining which is of higher value?
I think it would be great. Maybe we just want to go through the different tasks and folks can talk about like whether they consider a task to be higher priority or lower priority, if they have asked any questions that they might have about projects.
Okay.
If there are any tasks that you have concerns about funding, that would be important to know.
Okay, great. All right, let's, Josh.
Before we get started on that, have we heard back on the discretionary grants at all yet?
No.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, let's see. We have 2 projects. There's LTD Project A, and then Link Lane, LCOG has Project B. So Project A has 33 tasks, and then Project B has 6 tasks. And we have till 6:30. So let's go ahead.
And we don't have to cover every single task. If there are some that everyone is in agreement on, or that there are no questions about, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, let's start with task 1. This is Ride Source ADA, paratransit, and shopper shuttle. Any thoughts or questions on that? Any guidance?
Anybody else?
Yeah, go, Josh.
So for me, for all of these, and I don't think I need to say it for all of them, but anything with 5310 or 5311 funding component, I feel like is a priority, because otherwise we're not getting the full amount we could out of those dollars.
Right.
So those, I don't know, high
Yeah.
priority, low priority,
Right.
but
Yeah.
all of those
I would
rise
agree.
higher for me.
Yeah, it's putting your money to work, so to speak. I would agree with Josh's statement. Is there anybody who wouldn't agree with that, or no? Oh, all right. Well, actually, maybe instead of doing like each one individually, we have them up on the screen there. I see to start with tasks 1 through 12. Let's start with that as a batch and see if folks have comments or questions. I did hear, I think John was in his presentation talking about, was it task 1 is a requirement, right, of paratransit. So to me, that seems very high priority.
And these first 12 tasks that we have listed here are all of the tasks that John went through.
Right.
They're all the 5310, 5311
Okay, great.
matching tasks.
Were there more than just the task 1 that was like considered a requirement though? Sorry, John.
No apologies needed. It's my pleasure to be here. So technically,
there's no requirement that we do anything. I should be more clear that paratransit is a requirement because we have fixed route bus service. So while we provide fixed route bus service, we must also make sure that for people with disabilities that are unable to use the bus, that we provide a complementary paratransit system that accommodates.
John, I'm sorry, could you clarify when you say fixed route bus, that's not necessarily MX? That's
correct.
Yeah, it's
our
just
numbered
the
bus
right.
system
Yes.
in the metro area.
Thanks.
And so with that comes a requirement that people with disabilities also who are unable to access that system have a paratransit system that is able to accommodate. And so our federal requirement is that within 3/4 of a mile where our metro fixed route buses go, so must our paratransit system. So that's where that requirement part comes from. Technically, we don't have to offer a bus as we could be offering other modes or be doing other things. And with that could potentially remove the paratransit requirement. For example, though, in city of Florence, we offer a fixed route bus system called the Rhodey Express. We must also offer a complementary paratransit system for that. However, in Oak Ridge, we have a different type of bus. It's more of a commuter, intercity bus, and with that does not come a paratransit requirement. So just some of the nuance on how that works. These other tasks are, it's difficult to, I wouldn't call them exactly requirements. However, for instance, if we didn't perform preventive maintenance on our vehicles, very quickly our services would be falling apart. So I would say they're interdependent in many ways. And these population-based formula programs are typically complementary of one another. So for instance, the transportation eligibility assessments are assessments to support the ride source service, which is the requirement, which is needs preventive maintenance to be able to run and function. Many of these programs, if we didn't offer them, we would need to still find ways to provide transportation in what I would consider or characterize as a more expensive or less efficient manner. So these programs, by their nature, are able to provide transportation in what, through our staff technical expertise, would characterize as the best use of resources to be able to provide transportation to our community. So many of these types of trips, if they weren't provided through these types of programs, they would start funneling through, say, our paratransit service, which would come at increased cost and in turn come out of, say, general fund dollars. And the more general fund dollars we're using to support our paratransit service, that's the less available for our fixed route bus, which shrinks the amount of transportation available to our community as a whole. A complicated answer to that.
It really is a system, right? I mean, it's everything's interconnected. When I look at kind of how this committee has prioritized in the past with maintaining existing service, then number 2, expanding existing service, 3, developing new service. Can you remind us, I don't think any of these tasks listed up here are developing a new service. Is that correct? Or
none of the population-based formula services are new. These are all continuations of existing services. So these have all existed in prior biennia, oftentimes for many years, if not decades.
Right. Okay. Yeah, Carrie.
Just follow up on that. Are any of the programs proposed to be expanded or just continuity of service?
Yeah, I'll highlight the main changes. So in our South Lane operations, there is the major change in the shift of 5311 funds from Cottage Grove to LTD. And with that, in the upcoming biennium, our proposal is to increase the amount of MOD or Cottage Grove connector service in the area with service outside of the city limits, hopefully to be covered through a rural on-demand pilot that we've submitted a stiff discretionary application for, not just in South Lane, but elsewhere throughout Lane County to increase our geographic area. And then the Florence Rhodey Express, we have doubled the amount of frequency on that service in the current biennium. So it's a continuation of existing services, but it is relatively new in that we've expanded the amount of service that we have in that area. I think otherwise the services are generally as listed. I would say looking back, in earlier biennium, we added a 4th trip on the Oak Ridge Diamond Express and a Saturday service pilot, which are incorporated into the proposal in the current STIF formula plan. Again, not new, but relatively recent change that was made.
Okay,
Otherwise, it's generally status quo.
right. Great. Thank you for that question. Other thoughts or questions on this list? Yeah, are we still, do we still have folks online or? Yeah. Okay. All right, well, that's 1 through 12. I think the next slide, if we could go to that one, it's 13 through 24, I believe. Yeah. And this one, there's a few red line items here. We had talked about task 14 having the $1 kind of holding place there. And then looks like task 17, trip planning mobility app, that was canceled because of the grant. Is that, Dave, is that the same as what was named the Project Zephyr before?
No, different. So Project Zephyr, just for the benefit of the group here and the public, was a collaborative effort between LTD, City of Eugene, and University of Oregon, and we applied for a federal earmark for that to support development of that app. That earmark has a relationship to the Attain grant, so you'll see. Trip Planning mobile app was a standalone app, separate from Mosey or Zephyr.
Right.
So we're crossing that one off because we received the news, the great news that we were awarded federal Attain dollars, which you see as task 24 down there, which is the match for the Attain project. Your question about the Zephyr app, our plan right now is to use that earmark to overmatch even more on the Attain project to be able to get that app out.
Okay.
So there's an app that's a programmatic element of the Attain project. So anyway, sorry, there's a lot there, but essentially the Attain project funds the app. We don't need a separate line item, and it will also allow us to use the earmark to expand that project a bit.
And that app would cover multiple modes, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
That's right.
Great. For the committee, any questions or comments on this section of tasks? Oh, Josh, I think you have your hand up. Josh Schmyatt.
Yeah, so I do have just a quick question in regarding task 13. I know LTD just recently went through their schedule changes 3 months ago back in September. I was kind of wondering if you might be able to kind of describe what kind of like the overall picture would be for a service increase and like kind of the timeline of kind of what that looks like.
That's a great question, and I'll take a stab at answering it. So there is a relationship between the recommendations contained within our system review final plan, which was approved by the board back in October. That gives us really clear guidance on as we're adding more operators, which has sort of been the constraint for us in terms of adding more service and frequency. The system review gives us pretty clear short-term and long-term recommendations in terms of how we add that service. Primarily, it's focused on adding frequency. There are some slight coverage additions, for example, out in West Eugene, where there's some new multifamily housing going in by the old Hynix plant. There's some new coverage out there. And we're in the process of mapping out an implementation plan for how we roll out those changes in the system review. STIF funding is a really important piece. So there's been the operator constraint, but we will, as we bring more operators on, we will hit a funding constraint. And so that's where STIF comes into play. And So you'll see task 13 right now suggests adding $4 million per year over the next biennium. And that equates to, we're sort of planning for about 35 new operators over that time period. And then in terms of revenue hours, I think I calculated it out. It's about a 17% increase from where we should be next year in terms of service hours. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Go ahead, Josh.
I just have a
questions?
quick follow-up to that. Your recent service increase from this fall was an 8% increase. That would be 17% on top of that recent increase?
Yeah, and it would be 17% increase from 25, so even a little bit more than where we're at right now. So we're continuing to roll out increases because we do have sufficient operators to do that. So I don't have an exact number for you, but it's 17.3% above 25 expected revenue hours.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just say, like, we're still fine tuning the outcome measures, so that's a really key piece of the STIF plan itself is we do quarterly reporting, and so we're fine tuning our outcome measures and our expectations here. So these numbers might fluctuate just a little bit, but that's what we're planning for.
Related to task 13, can you remind us, I know LTD, for example, they did what was called the fall bid, right? And remind me, are there more than, is it like twice a year?
So yeah, great question. So we do three service changes every year.
Okay.
So fall, summer, winter.
Okay.
And so typically we're doing outreach with our operators. We do take feedback from the public on specific changes, but typically with the 3 times a year changes, they're relatively small adjustments, not major adjustments.
I feel like this fall was a bigger one than usual, but in the positive direction.
That's right. It was the first significant increase since pre-COVID, right at the beginning of COVID.
Okay. So the task 13 it's providing the funding for those types of increases, but then there's separate processes through the bids 3 times a year to get into the specifics of how those would increase. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the way to think about it is 3 times a year, like under this scenario, assuming that we're able to continue hiring more operators and assuming we get this incremental increase in funding that can go towards our service hours, then at each of those 3 points during the year, we'll be able to increase service.
Okay.
And that is typically weekday service, Saturday service, Sunday service. So that's how we break it out.
Great. Thank you. Other thoughts or questions from the committee? Yes, Vidal.
This is just, I don't know if you know, but I'm looking at task 22. The safety improvement part of it. I don't know if you know it or not, but do you happen to know where those locations are that you're thinking about?
No.
And again, I'm assuming they're all over the place, but
yeah,
2 or 3 of the major ones.
It's a great question. I think the idea or the concept behind the task 22, which was just as a reminder, this is the one we've talked about it a couple times with this group, where we would have a pot of money that we could provide to roadway owners, jurisdictional roadway owners who have programmed projects. So for example, a roadway resurfacing project or restriping project or something like that, in which there is a fixed route transit stop on that roadway segment that could benefit from some kind of access improvement, whether it's crosswalk improvement. We just had one we were talking about at a service planning meeting today. It's a perfect example of where, we would like to see a new crossing put in, but there might just not be a pot of money available to support that. And so we would accept requests from roadway owners, and then we would work with them to look at programming that money. So no set locations yet. They'd be to be determined. And this is a good one. I don't know if you want to talk to this one at all. You know, $500,000 over a biennium doesn't go real far in terms of those types of projects. It might be able to accomplish maybe one small incremental project per year, I would say.
But if you're partnering with the agency,
it would leverage. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great question. Similar to what we asked on the last slide, I'm curious, are any of these up here, let's see, developing a new service?
I'll speak to the ones that I'm
Sure.
sure of. I'm sure John can help me out here, but the task 21, which is the transit shared mobility system integration, which is the bike share transit integration one. That's a new, well, not entirely new concept. It's not a new service, but it's modernizing an existing service. But it's in terms of a big capital investment, it's new for us. Then task 22, the transit access and safety program would be new. The community outcome initiative pilot would be new. That's 23. And then 24 is the Attain project. This is the federal funding to create a new on-demand service in the Bethel school district area.
Okay.
It's worth pointing out too, just on that last one, that's leveraging significant federal dollars, and this is our minimum match amount for that federal grant. So this is an important one for us to fully fund.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cosette.
I just want to point out on page 15 where we talk about the funding that's available. And if we look down at the funding that's available, down in the bottom, it says LTD estimated carryover. That's $17 million that we're carrying over from previous biennium. So, so as we look at these new projects, it's helpful for us to look at them in the context of these are one-time, potentially one-time costs, potentially that could help use some of that carryover in a way that we're not establishing something then that we won't be able to sustainably move forward in future bienniums.
Right. Okay.
And I would say a lot of these projects that are new, from my perspective, fit that bill.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Carrie.
Well, along the same lines, I see that for some of the vehicle purchasing ones as well. Like knowing that, yes, you do have to replace vehicles fairly often, but if you could get a handful of new vehicles using some of that, that leverages it for further out to come too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Josh?
Do we know how much of that $17 million carryover is due to unexpected planned funds and how much is due to the STIF program getting more money than expected and then that not being in the plan to spend?
I don't know if I don't think we're prepared with those figures tonight, but I think we could probably obtain those figures for you. I mean, a significant chunk of it, and just being straight with you here, was the planned service increase from last cycle that we were unable to implement.
Yeah, I think the reason I asked the question is because when we're talking about prioritizing or trying to balance the number on page 15, I feel like if we try too hard to get down to a number that feels balanced, we might be leaving some stuff on the table where we'll have funds available, but then we can't spend them because we haven't programmed in that higher amount.
I think part of that speaks to LTDs and the QE strategy to consolidate tasks under one project so that we can be more nimble it can be somewhat challenging to be able to create a stiff plan that can account for things that are happening over 2 years in the future. And so I think a plan like this, for instance, looking at things like a mobility on demand pilot with a $2 placeholder does give us more flexibility. And that's just through the experience of us being able to learn from prior biennia at this point.
Okay, great. Other thoughts or questions from the committee on this list, task 13 through 24? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to
Yes.
follow up to Josh's question and just because as we've been through this process a number of times, I think there was only one cycle where we didn't have an overage in it. And that's the cycle when we actually ended up with a little extra. And I think that the very first cycle, ODOT asked us to put in a 30% increase. And then I think the second cycle they did not. And that's when we ended up with a little bit of extra. And then they asked for the 20%, just so you kind of know. That's the only time it's happened. That was an extra rollover.
Carrie.
Just for the sake of feedback, because that's what you've asked for. The only task that would give me any sort of minor consternation that I would put as a lower priority would be task 21. And I'm not saying to eliminate that. That's the shared integration mobility. And I'm not saying that that should be eliminated, but I'm seeing that as a whole new thing that LTD is taking on. And I wouldn't want it to detract from some of the other really valuable services that LTD is really good at doing. And so as much as I like the idea of trying to tie things together and getting the first and last mile connections, now you're going to be in the business of maintaining bikes. And what does that do for operations and continuity and more costs down the future? So the only one that kind of pops out to me is like, well, that's new and it's different. And I hate to throw out something else for that one.
Right. Okay, thank you. Josh.
I guess as a follow-up to that, what would be LTD's plan for operations and sort of ongoing maintenance of that system? Would you be doing that in-house? Would you work with a local partner? What does that look like?
I think you could expect the operations to continue under the same model that it's operated under today, which is the city of Eugene holds the contract with a nonprofit operator who's charged with maintenance and storage of vehicles. The city of Eugene owns almost all of the bicycle assets. I think like 90% of the bicycles Eugene owns. And so the expectation is that it would use that same model. I will also say that right now, Cascadia Mobility is submitting an application for innovative mobility plan dollars from the state of Oregon to basically, so they can develop the plan that will support this expansion. So we're partnering with them in that project.
Yeah,
And
this is
we have been in the past week just discussing cutting a little bit of that funding for that particular task because there will be funding coming in from other grant sources as well.
Right. Yeah, I was going to weigh in on this too. I've been in numerous regional meetings with the city, LTD, U of O, LCOG, others about it's the regional mobility working group that we've had. And there's been, for the last several years, a big effort to get, LTD or encourage LTD to have more commitment towards micromobility. But I also appreciate what Carrie is saying. It is so hard in this process to look at, like K through 12 student passes or low income fare programs and try to determine like where do you cut. So my hope is there's other grants. I mean, I hope LTD can still put some towards this, but also that there's a continued effort to keep looking for funding. Any other comments from the committee on this section before we go to tasks 25 through 33? All right, not hearing any, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. This represents the last bit for project A. And then after this one, we'll look at the project B, which has 6 tasks. So maybe to start us off on discussion here, similar to the other slides, for staff, do you guys want to speak to any of these that might represent new service versus either maintaining existing or expanding existing?
So new versus
yeah, versus expand or yeah, like expanding existing or maintaining existing.
So we've already spoken about task 25, which is the rural on-demand services. So that's, and maybe one thing to note about some of these are, some of these represent match for discretionary asks. So it's kind of interesting timing. We find ourselves, we're developing our formula plan. We don't have the news on the discretionary asks. So I think this is one of those ones where you might see some changes based off of the discretionary awards once we find out about those. But anyway, the first one essentially represents an expansion of an existing pilot service. The Florence Mobility Hub is another match for a discretionary ask that we partnered with the city of Florence on to do a site design and plan for a future mobility hub. I think John explained what that was last time around. So that's a new project. The shopper shuttle replacement vehicle, so existing service, new vehicle. Okay. Eugene, task 28, Eugene Safe Streets and Roads for All. This is a new task within our plan, and this is providing match for a grant that the city of Eugene was awarded, a federal grant to do a safety study on related to transit access within their city. So a pretty clear nexus to LTD's needs and interests. I will say on this one, I am likely going to propose expanding the definition of this particular line item to be inclusive of a grant funded project that the city would be delivering related to transit improvements on River Road coming out of the moving ahead work. So dollar amount won't change necessarily on this, but we would expand the definition to be inclusive of 2 specific project matches. Fair management match. We have a project in our community investment plan slated to begin, I believe, next fiscal year for a new fare management system for our for LTD services. So this is a new project, and it represents match for a much larger multi-year project. Task 30 is the downtown. Or do you want to? And I can stop if you want to ask.
I think we have one question.
Just a quick question on that last one, the fair management match. Have you obtained that grant, or that's a grant you will be going for with this?
So this is matching. I think we would use federal dollars that we already have. So this is from our FTN safety and amenity line items.
Okay.
Yeah. So
thank you.
Funds that we already have. Yeah. The next one is the Eugene Downtown and Riverfront Circulator Project, and this is another discretionary ask that well, LTD and City of Eugene collaborated on submitting, and this would be in representing new service, so $100,000. Sustainable service reserve. I probably can't speak to that quite as well. This is an existing STIF project, task rather. And then the last 2, 32 and 33, represent STIF administrative costs, and then our contingency amount on the overall anticipated stiff formula funds.
Kate, did you have?
I was just gonna say number for the sustainable service reserve, that's a requirement based on LTDs. Based on the service expansion that's planned, LTD has to have 2 months, 3 months of operations money set aside to be able to continue that on. So this is that piece of that to help continue with that service. So that one is one that would be required based on LTD's policies.
Good to know. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving unless I'm not seeing any hands up. So we have now, if we can move to the last project, which is Project B. This is through LCOG, I believe, and there's tasks 1 through 6. And then maybe we review this, and then after that, I'd love to hear from committee colleagues here about any overarching prioritization ideas. Anything on this, task 1 through 6?
I would like to also note for this one is very dependent on discretionary funds. So I think that this is one where most of these tasks, well, at least the operations one, will hopefully change to be less of an ask, assuming we get a greater match from the intercommunity and 5311F. But we're just planning for worst case scenario right now.
Can you or somebody remind us, when do we find out about the answer for the discretionary funds? Is that coming up here pretty soon?
So the staff and the staff committee at ODOT has met about this, and it will come to the PTAC, and the PTAC meets December 2nd. So that's when the official PTAC vote will happen, which I think will probably be a really good, like technically it's not approved until it goes to the OTC, but I think generally once it's made it through PTAC, that's really where most
pretty solid.
Yeah, so I think we'll have a really good understanding once PTAC reviews on December 2nd.
Which will be before our next meeting, right? Which is just before. Okay. All right. Josh,
Kate, can you remind us if any of these represent new service or expansion?
The only one that is task, which the Eugene to Florence connector to increase a little bit of operations costs to go. Currently, Eugene Florence runs 7 days a week, 2 times per day, and then 4 days a week, an extra trip per day. And we would like to make that easier to just say and to operate and to let our riders know that we operate 7 days a week, 3 times a day. So that's where we would like to get to. That's the service increase.
Great, thank you.
And the student and the low income and student fare program is new.
Okay. Other questions or comments from the committee? All right. In order to move us forward here, I'm going to put out a proposal to the committee, see what people think, but this is based on what I was hearing folks say, and then reading the suggestion in Kathleen's email. So I was thinking, what if we talked about giving our recommendation to LTD staff to prioritize any of these tasks that go towards leveraging other federal funds or state funds, right? And like Josh had talked in the beginning about 5310, 5311, and then so that would be like number 1 because it's making your money work, and then number 2 might be maintaining existing service or operations. Number 3 would be expanding existing service or operations. And then 4 would be developing new service. I'm just throwing that out there as a starting point for reaction. But anybody seeing a few head nods, but or these are pretty broad brush strokes here, but Josh, you look like you're going to say something here.
If if we have the potential for more information before our next meeting,
Yeah.
unless people are really wanting to get this done tonight, I feel like having more information on where the discretionary grants are will help us in prioritizing, and so maybe
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good idea.
push off to the next meeting.
Yeah, I think I just meant this to be like a starting point for us to kind of think about. We can hold that, like you said, hear from staff on the discretionary funds and
And our hope is that we can present the discretionary outcomes at the December 3rd meeting.
okay, great. Well, with that, can I hand it back to you, Kathleen, for next steps?
Yeah, I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna save this. These are some potential future updates to the plan. I will put those in the packet, some additional budget cuts that we're planning to make. And we will plan to meet again on December 3rd. Like I said, hopefully we will have the stiff discretionary outcomes at that point and an updated budget and closer to a balanced budget for you to review.
Great. Yes, Krista.
I just want to point out that given that we'll just get the discretionary updates the night before, we won't have a lot to review before the meeting that we have on December 3rd. So, but it's a critical meeting.
Yeah,
so,
that makes sense. So it'll likely not be in the packet, you're saying, but it'll be presented or?
Yeah, we will not be able to get it in the
yeah,
packet, but
right.
Kate and I will do our best to have
Right.
it all available that
All right.
evening for you to review.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds great. Yeah, we appreciate that. Yes, Kosa.
Also, I just want to mention, so we have the December 3rd meeting, and then I believe we have one on December 10th.
December 10th.
So at one or at either of those meetings, this committee could potentially take a motion to make a recommendation to the board. So it could be at the December 3rd meeting or at the December 10th meeting, correct?
Okay.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So we could be motivated to get it all done at the next meeting, perhaps. But okay, great. Anything else from Kathleen?
Nothing else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. We'll go ahead and adjourn. Have a great evening.